This lecture is about milk. This lecture is mainly about cow's milk, although many aspects that are applicable to cow's milk will also be true about milk from other animals. Cow's milk is an opaque white liquid. It's opaque and white due to fat globules and protein molecules that are suspended in it. It has a very faint odor and very mild flavor, a very bland flavor. It is very slightly sweet and just perceptibly salty. Typically, a high-quality milk has very little flavor other than the basic slight sweetness and slight saltiness. General composition of milk will be 3.8% fat, 3.2% protein, 4.8% carbohydrates, 0.7% minerals, 87.5% water. Most milk samples that you would actually collect and measure will be somewhat different from that because milks deviate in their composition due to the breed of the cow, the state of lactation that the cow is in, the animal's feed, the time of year, and a variety of other factors. So rarely will you get a sample of milk that has this exact composition. You can, if you want to break it down to rules of thumb, you can pretty much say it has about 4% fat, 4% protein, and 4% carbohydrate. It's not perfect, but it's not much less accurate than the values that I've listed here. This is somewhat of a simplified composition. Milks also contain a variety of other miscellaneous organic compounds, but not in large quantities. We will look first at the fats in milk, and the fat in milk is called butterfat. It exists as minute droplets called globules that float around through the milk, and these globules are surrounded by a fat globule membrane, which prevents them from coalescing and keeps the globules separate. This is a schematic picture of that fat globule membrane. Your takeaways from this should be that it is several molecules thick. These are molecules, or these. It's several molecules thick. It's quite complex. That's good enough. You can also see in here these molecules that are diagrammed with red heads and black tails. These are phospholipids. So you can also say that the membrane is probably largely made up of phospholipids, but a variety of other things as well. The actual fat itself is here in the core center of the fat globule. This is all the fat globule membrane. Now, since fat is less dense than water, the fat globules in milk are going to tend to float up to the surface. So if you let milk fresh from the cow sit in a container, the fat will rise to the top and form a layer of cream. Most milk that you would buy in the grocery store in the United States is homogenized, and homogenization is a process that reduces the size of the fat globules. It essentially forces the milk, including the fat globules, through a very fine screen, which splits up the fat globules into smaller fat globules. If the fat globules are very small, they will not rise, they will remain suspended. So homogenized milk does not form a cream layer. It's also slightly more viscous than the non-homogenized version of the same milk would be. Now, if we look inside those fat globules at the fat itself, butterfat has two important characteristics. First of all, is that the fats are highly saturated, relatively highly saturated. And second, that there is, compared to other food fats, there's a fairly large number of short-chain fatty acids. And by large number, I mean like maybe 12% of fairly short-chain fatty acids, but this is quite high compared to other food products. Now, if you allow your milk fresh from the cow to sit and the fat globules rise and you get a layer of cream, if you take that cream and now you agitate it, and you can do that by putting it into a butter churn. You can also do that by just putting it into a jar and shaking the jar, or you can do that by putting it into a bowl and whisking it vigorously. When you agitate it, you damage those fat globule membranes, and as you start to damage those fat globule membranes, the fat globules start sticking together, and they form aggregates together, and these aggregates provide the structure of whipped cream. In order to be whippable, this cream needs to have probably at least 36% fat in it. So you have a pretty high concentration of fat globules in that liquid. And when you whip that, you damage the fat globule membranes, and those fat globules start sticking together. And then you can beat air into that mix. And the structure of the foam that you get that is whipped cream, the structure of that foam is made up by the fat globules. I'll show you a picture of it. This is a single air cell in whipped cream, and these things surrounding that air cell are fat globules. So you can see the fat globules are sticking to each other, and they are lining the surface of the air cell. A couple other pictures of this, now sort of stepping back. These are the air cells. This is another air cell. And if you look closely, you can see for these air cells, there are a lot of little bumps in those. Each of those little bumps is a fat globule. This is a little bit of a closer up look at those air cells. So this is one air cell, and you see inside, you see that there are lots and lots of little bumps in here. These are all little fat globules. So the fat globules are providing the structure of the foam that is whipped cream. Now, if you continued whipping or beating the cream beyond the point where you got whipped cream, the fat globule membranes are damaged more and more, and you end up getting two separate phases. So you then have the phase of the fat and the phase of the liquid. When you work it to this extent, you end up with butter. And this is exactly how butter's made. They take cream, they agitate it extensively until the fat is pretty much separating it out, and then they work that fat a little bit more to squeeze out most of the water, and you end up with a product that's butter. Finished butter is 80% fat. That's a legal requirement. The rest is the other constituents of milk. So it's whatever is left in the milk that's still hanging around those chunks of fat. If you add salt, salt makes up part of that remaining 20%. As sort of a side here, margarine is also required by law to contain 80% fat. Margarine was originally a substitute for butter, a cheap version of butter, to prevent consumers from being ripped off and not getting as much fat, because fat is an expensive thing to buy. Margarine has a legal definition that specifies that it must contain 80% fat. So when you get a sort of a low-fat margarine, it's not called a low-fat margarine, it will be called a spread. Now, fats in milk are important for the texture of milk. If you compare skim milk to whole milk, skim milk is much more watery. Whole milk is noticeably thicker than skim milk. Fats also contribute to the flavor of the milk, but perhaps not in the way you might think. So you might think, well, if whole milk has a lot more fat, does it then start tasting like butter? And the answer to that is no. Whole milk doesn't taste like butter. What the role of the fats in milk appear to be more that they absorb other flavors from the milk. So if you have a very low fat milk, like if you have a skim milk almost always has the flavor of the vitamin mix, the flavor of the animal feed, some certain amount of cooked flavor that develops in milk. And whole milk has much less of those. And the reason it has less of those is that a lot of the flavor compounds that produce the cooked flavor or the feed flavor or whatever are now absorbed into the fat. So they're not available for you to perceive as the drinker of the milk or the consumer of the milk. So we'll move on to the proteins in milk. Proteins in milk are what's mainly responsible for the whiteness of the milk. They are responsible for some of the flavors that milk has, or some of the flavors that are produced in milk products. They are what's responsible for the thickness of milk and also the thickness of products that are made from milk. They're responsible for forming the curds that produce the foundation, the textural foundation of cheeses and so forth. So there are two main classes of proteins in milk. The first of these are the caseins. We'll look at those first, and then the second class will be the whey proteins. So the majority of proteins in milk are the caseins. And the caseins contain a lot of calcium and a lot of phosphorus that's integrally bound into the caseins. We have 4 different types of caseins: alpha, beta, gamma, and kappa. And these 4 different types of caseins are aggregated together in structures called micelles. We'll take a look at this. This is a diagram of a casein micelle. And there are 4 different types of caseins, the alpha, beta, gamma, and kappa. The kappas here are arranged along the outside, and the kappas have a couple little tails on them. We'll talk about those later, sort of water-soluble tails. The alpha, beta, and gamma caseins are arrayed in the center caseins, and these little blue dots here are calcium phosphates. So that's the calcium and the phosphorus, the phosphates in milk are inside of these casein micelles. So these are fairly large structures. Each one of these is a protein, so they're fairly good sized on their own, and now they're clumped together in this complex. And then on the outside of this micelle, this sphere, are arranged the kappa caseins with their their little hairs. Now, the kappa casein and the presence of these hairs is a main reason that these micelles remain stable and suspended throughout the milk. The presence of these hairs especially prevent the casein molecules from bumping into each other and linking together or precipitating together. And if they did that, they would form a curd. But sometimes you want to have a curd. For example, when you make cheese, you want to have a curd. Many types of cheese that in the process of making cheese, they add the enzyme chymosin. And what chymosin does is it splits off a portion of the kappa casein molecule, and more specifically, it splits off some of these hairs. These hairs are responsible for the water solubility. And when the chymosin splits off these hairs, it allows these casein micelles now to stick to each other and to form clumps. And when that happens, you get a curd formed. The name for that curd is a chymosin curd or a renin curd. You can actually buy the enzyme chymosin, and I should add here that I may use the term chymosin and renin interchangeably. Chymosin is sort of the official name for that enzyme now. We talked about it earlier in our section on enzymes. The reason the word renin and now here we'll bring in a new one, rennet, still exist in the language is that the source of this enzyme was originally from calves' stomachs. So calves are obviously big consumers of cow's milk, and the first step in their digestion is to form a curd for that milk. It holds it in the stomach a little longer and enables it to be more thoroughly digested. The source of the enzyme chymosin for many, many years came from the stomachs of calves. And of course, you had to kill the calf in order to get the calf's stomach to get that enzyme. Years later, as they figured out what that enzyme was, they genetically engineered bacteria to make this enzyme. So cows are no longer slaughtered to make your cheese. Instead, bacteria have been genetically engineered to make your cheese. Which is one thing in the United States, if you have cheeses that are made from like a cheddar or a Swiss cheese, something like that in the process of making that cheese, they use chymosin. That chymosin will have been produced by genetically engineered bacteria. Thus, most cheeses that you get in the United States, you could not say that they are GMO-free. This is actually also true in most other countries as well. Most of the source of the enzymes for making cheeses are coming from bacteria nowadays. They're not coming from the stomachs of calves. But back to this picture, this is just the reminder that you can actually buy this enzyme. This picture sort of comes from something I got at Byerly's a few years ago. You read the back of this package, you say it comes in tablets. You can throw a tablet into some milk, and you let the milk sit for an hour or so, and it congeals into a pudding. So that would call it a rennet pudding, which is really a chymosin pudding and so forth. But you can also use these tablets if you wanted to make your own cheese at home. If you wanted a renin curd, you can also get the chymosin enzymes in cheese making kits and various other sources. So the type of curd I just talked about, which is the chymosin curd. So the chymosin curd is a curd you get when you add the enzyme chymosin to milk, and it's going to split off those hairy things off of the kappa casein. It's going to enable the casein micelles to clump together, and the curd you get as a result of that is a rennin curd. This is different from an acid curd, and an acid curd is something you get by just adding acid to milk. And this should look like a familiar slide because we talked about it when we had the general lecture on proteins. So this could be milk as it comes out of the cow. The protein, this is a protein molecule, so this would be a casein protein. And the casein proteins as they come out of the cow have a net negative charge, has a lot to do with those phosphate groups in it. When you add acid to this, you neutralize some of those charges and you bring the protein to the isoelectric point where there's no net charge. At this point, these casein micelles can also begin to clump together and stick together. They don't make quite as dense of a curd as they would if you had added chymosin, but they do make a curd. And that is called an acid curd. And the acid curd is the type of curd, or the reason why you have a solid product. In the case of paneer, which is an Indian cheese, the American versions of that are cottage cheese, cream cheese, sometimes farmer's cheese. So some cheeses are just acid curds. Other cheeses, especially cheese that is hard, is going to be both, frankly, an acid curd and a rennin curd or a chymosin curd. So caseins were the largest group of milk proteins. So the other main group of milk proteins are the whey proteins. And the whey proteins are the proteins that are left after you've made a curd from the caseins. When you make a curd from the caseins, the liquid that drains off of that sort of syneresis off of that is called the whey. And the proteins in that liquid are called the whey proteins. So there's several different proteins in this. I'm only going to mention one of them for this class, and that protein is called beta-lactoglobulin. And I mention it here because it's a sulfur-containing protein. It has sulfur-containing amino acids in it. And some of these amino acids, the sulfur groups on those amino acids can be split off, especially during heating, and contribute to a cooked flavor of milk. Other proteins that you find in the whey proteins are the enzymes. Sort of the most famous enzyme in milk is the lipase enzyme. And in this day and age, you can buy the whey proteins. They serve as ingredients in many of the high protein foods. So if you have high protein beverages, you have to read the label. But often the protein source for those will be whey proteins. High protein bars, again, often the source of protein for those is whey proteins. And frankly, you can just buy the whey proteins in little jars or great big containers to make your own protein beverages, high protein beverages, or high protein snacks yourself. So that covers the fats in milks, the proteins in milks. The carbohydrate in milk we won't spend any time on. We've talked about it before. It's lactose. And you have the formula from earlier in the class. There's also a variety of vitamins and minerals that naturally occur in milk and are important for nutrition reasons. So milk naturally contains vitamins A, K, not D, but they typically do contain D now in the United States because their milk is fortified with vitamin D. Milk's also a great source of riboflavin, and of course it's a good source of calcium and phosphorus, and we saw that the calcium and the phosphate groups were tied up in those casein micelles. I want to briefly cover a few milk products that are out there, things that you buy in the grocery store that are made from milk. First of all, we have the fluid milk products. So in the fluid milk product section of your store, you probably have a choice of whole milk, and whole milk in Minnesota is 3.5% fat. I grew up in Oregon, and whole milk there by definition or legally has to contain 3.8% fat, so that definition of whole milk differs around the country and probably around the world. Then typically we also have 2% milk. To make 2% milk, they take the whole milk, and actually what they do in most dairies is they take the whole milk as it comes in, it's pasteurized, and the fat is separated off, and then they add the fat back in. So the fat is separated off as a fairly dense cream, and then the cream is bled back in to make a whole milk with the minimum amount of fat that's legally required. So in Minnesota, that's 3.5%. They can also take that skim milk and mix it with enough fat to make a 2% milk, make another batch which just has enough fat for 1% milk. Another batch would be the skim milk where they would not add any of this fat back. They can then make half and half. Half and half is it's half milk and half cream. The legal definition of cream in the United States is like 18% fat, but you can't actually go to the grocery store and buy cream with 18% fat. Instead you have the half and half, which is half milk at about 4% fat and half the cream at 18% fat. You can also buy whipping cream in the United States, and whipping cream in the United States requires 36% fat. A little farther along in the same refrigerated display cases, you can find buttermilk and some other fluid cultured products. I'll just talk about buttermilk. Buttermilk, when you buy it in the grocery store, is not the milk that's left over from making butter. Buttermilk is made by you have to read the label on this, but it's usually taking either 1% milk or skim milk, and they add bacteria to it. The bacteria produce acid and produce a certain amount of flavors, and the acid doesn't quite make it curd, but it thickens it. So buttermilk is thicker than the normal fluid milk products. It's thicker, it's slightly more acidic, and it has a characteristic flavor that is produced by the bacteria. You will get cultured buttermilk if the label says it's cultured buttermilk, and that's pretty much what you buy when you buy buttermilk in the fresh milk section of a store. Sometimes you can buy buttermilk that is a real buttermilk, but it's usually in the dried form, and it's usually in the baking section of the store. Most of the real buttermilk that's made from making butter, so they've taken the cream and they've churned it, and they've taken off the fat and made it into butter, and the leftover milk from that's what we call the real buttermilk. That's usually dried or purchased by manufacturers of ice cream. The real buttermilk is really high in the fat globule membranes. There's a high concentration of fat globule membranes in that, a lot of phospholipids. It's very smooth. It's a very, very smooth texture, and makes a very desirable addition to an ice cream mix. You can also buy evaporated milk. Evaporated milk is in the canned section, usually in the baking section of the store, so it's always a canned product. To make evaporated milk, they evaporate a little bit more than 50% of the liquid, and then they can it. So it's heat treated so it won't spoil and won't make anybody sick. It's a fairly stiff heat treatment to do that, and you get a lot of Maillard reaction happening in that. So the evaporated milk is usually a very light brown color or a tan color. It's not the pure white that fresh milk would be. Evaporated milk also has some what we call the cooked flavor of milk, and the cooked flavor of milk is coming from the breakdown of the beta-lactoglobulin, so the sulfur compounds coming off of beta-lactoglobulin are creating what we call the cooked flavor of milk. So evaporated milk has both the cooked flavor coming from the sulfur released from the beta-lactoglobulin molecules. It also has flavor coming from the Maillard reaction. Also, close by the evaporated milk in your store is going to be sweetened condensed milk. And sweetened condensed milk is evaporated milk with a lot of sugar added. They started adding a lot of sugar to this because it was easier to kill the microorganisms when there was a high concentration of sugar there. So they did not have to give the milk quite such a high heat treatment. It did not develop quite as extensive a cooked flavor and quite as extensive a brown color. But it is very sweet. You have to be careful when you are reading recipes, because even though you might think that condensed means evaporated in a recipe, if they're asking for condensed milk, they probably mean sweetened condensed milk. They probably do not mean evaporated milk. And there's a lot of sugar in sweetened condensed milk. You'll get quite a different product if you substitute one of these for the other. The sweetened condensed milk is one small step away from the dulce de leche. In fact, you can make dulce de leche pretty easily from the sweetened condensed milk. You just heat it a little bit more until it gets a little bit browner. And then it's very caramel-like because, of course, you have a lot of Maillard reaction products going on here, very high protein, very high sugar environment, and you'll get a lot of the browning occurring, and that's very desirable and produces a characteristic flavor of dulce de leche. We also have some dried milk products. The main dried milk product that people buy is just the instant milk. To make this, they take skim milk, because the fats in milk are not very stable to being dried and being stored for a long time. So the dried milk is typically made from a skim milk. They take it, concentrate a little bit, maybe evaporate some of the water off of it under low heat conditions, and then they spray the milk into a spray dryer. So spray dryers are very large, hollow things. If you go into the Food Science and Nutrition building and go walk up on the overlook to the pilot plant, you'll see right sort of very close to your face is the top of a spray dryer, and the bottom of that spray dryer is in the basement, and that's a pilot plant size spray dryer, and an industrial size spray dryer will probably be 4 or 5 stories tall. But what you do is you spray the milk, and at the top of that spray dryer, the spray dryer is just a huge chamber of warm, dry air. And as the milk falls, as the mist of milk falls down through that chamber, the water evaporates off of it, and what you have at the bottom is the dried milk. One of the problems with the dried milk, if that's all you do, the dried milk at the bottom, the particles are very, very small, and they don't hydrate very well. It's a little bit more like adding talcum powder to water. So if you took a spoonful of this dried milk and you put it on top of a glass of water, it would just sit on top of the water. It doesn't disperse very well into water. And so to make it disperse better in water, they instantize it. To do that, if you imagine that you have these particles of dried milk that are falling through the spray drying chamber, and when you're a little bit more than halfway down and they're all dry, now you could spray a very, very fine mist of water in. Those little bits of dried milk are going to stick on those water droplets, and then as the water droplets fall down a little farther, the water is going to evaporate out of them, and you're left with little sort of packets of milk powders, and those little packets are much, much easier to disperse in water. So if you buy powdered milk, dried milk at a store, it's pretty much for sure going to be that instantized version. So you can just take a spoonful of it and stir it into cold water, and it will disperse. Lastly, I want to say just a few things about milk flavor. The desirable flavor of milk, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, is it's very bland and it's slightly sweet. Most other flavors that you have in milk are considered to be off flavors, and so we have a very long list of very typical and very commonly occurring off flavors. So one source of off flavors you get is the animal's diet. It's very common for milk to have a feed flavor to it, so that's the flavor of the feed. Most feed that's given to cows that are producing milk does not contain some of the more striking odoriferous products in it, such as onion and garlic. If you have wild onion or wild garlic growing in the pasture where your cattle are feeding, that flavor will pass on into their milk. And people obviously don't like it. So the diet of these animals is somewhat controlled, so it won't produce strong flavors in the milk, but the diet of the animal is responsible, or can be responsible, for off flavors in milk. Spoilage microorganisms produce off flavors. Most people that drink milk have experienced that at some time. If that carton of milk has been in your refrigerator a long time, there's microorganisms in it, and they will spoil it, and those also produce characteristic off flavors. Fat rancidity can produce off flavors. These are actually very uncommon in the milks produced in this country, because the milk is almost always pasteurized, and the pasteurization inactivates the enzymes. So you don't get the hydrolytic rancidity. You also typically don't get oxidative rancidity in milk. And that's mainly because most of the things that would cause oxidation or catalyze the oxidation are kept out of contact of the milk when it's processed. We can get off flavors that develop from sunlight. So if you have the milk in a clear glass container and it's out in the sun, there's a reaction between riboflavin and methionine that give a very characteristic sunlight off flavor to the milk. We have heat-induced off flavors. The higher the temperature and the longer the time that milk is exposed to during the pasteurization, the more of these heat-induced off flavors you will have. We mentioned one earlier, and I can mention it again here because it is one of the main sources of the cooked flavor, and that's the breakdown of the beta-lactoglobulin. So beta-lactoglobulin is one of the whey proteins. It contains some amino acids that have sulfur groups on that. With heat, some of those sulfur groups detach themselves and become volatile, producing the what we call the cooked flavor in milk.